Miss Marple and the Clock That Stopped at 3:30. Good evening, dear listeners. Welcome to Quiet Clues. I'm William, and it's truly a pleasure to have you here with me for a while. Before we drift into the mystery, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night reached for you? Leave a note below and subscribe if you'd like these quiet tales to become a gentle part of your routine. Now, let us step softly into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. A quiet arrival in the village of Aldwick. Nothing ever happened in a hurry. That was something the villagers prided themselves on. Time moved differently there, measured not by clocks but by habits. Morning arrived when Mrs. Holloway opened her curtains. Afternoon began when the postman crossed the square. Evening settled when the lights in the vicarage came on. And yet, one morning, time stopped. Not everywhere, just in one house, at exactly 3:30. Miss Clara Whitcomb noticed it first. She was not a woman who noticed things accidentally. She noticed because she looked, because she listened, because she remembered, and because she had lived long enough to know that when something small went wrong, it was rarely small at all. She stood in the hallway of her cottage, her coat already buttoned, her handbag resting on her arm. The clock above the sideboard stared back at her. Its hands were frozen. 3:30. Miss Whitcomb frowned slightly. That won't do, she murmured. She had wound that clock the night before. She was certain of it. It had belonged to her sister, and before that, their mother. It had ticked through births, weddings, and funerals. It did not stop without reason. She leaned closer. The second hand was perfectly still, as if it had simply given up. Miss Whitcomb did not touch it. She never did touch things immediately. Instead, she stepped back, took a breath, and waited. Outside, the village continued its morning routine. A cart rattled past. A dog barked once, then thought better of it. Someone laughed near the bakery. Time, everywhere else, was behaving normally. Only this clock had chosen to stop. Later that day, Miss Whitcomb found herself walking toward the village green. She had no clear reason for going there, and yet she went. At the corner, near the old oak tree, she encountered Mrs. Butt Pritchard, who was always eager to share news, even when there wasn't any. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Pritchard asked, lowering her voice unnecessarily. Miss Whitcomb smiled politely. "Heard what?" "The clock at the Harrington house stopped," Mrs. Pritchard said. 3:30. Exactly. Miss Whitcomb felt something settle into place. "Did it?" she said mildly. "Yes, and they say Mr. Harrington wasn't home when it happened." Miss Whitcomb nodded slowly. "Interesting," she said. She said nothing more. That evening, as lamps flickered on across Alderwick, Miss Whitcomb sat in her armchair, hands folded, eyes half closed. The clock in her hallway still read 3:30. She had not restarted it. Some things, she believed, were better observed before they were corrected, because clocks, like people, sometimes stopped for reasons far more complicated than worn springs or loose gears, and somewhere in the village a truth was waiting, quietly, patiently, just like Miss Clara Whitcomb herself. Chapter 2. 3:30. There are people who notice when things are missing, and then there are people like Miss Clara Whitcomb who notice when things are out of place. The next morning, she did not restart the clock. She passed it deliberately, glancing at its unmoving hands with a calm, thoughtful expression, as though greeting an old acquaintance who had chosen silence. 3:30. Still. She made her tea, butterly toasted her bread. Read a few lines from the newspaper. Nothing in the headlines suggested anything unusual, and yet Miss Whitcomb had learned long ago that the most important disturbances rarely announced themselves loudly. Later, she set out toward the post office. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and fallen leaves. At the corner by the vicarage gate, she encountered Reverend Miles, who was adjusting his scarf with unnecessary urgency. "Good morning," Miss Whitcomb said gently. "Oh, good morning," he replied, a touch too quickly. She noticed that at once. "Everything well?" she asked. "Yes, yes, of course," the Reverend said, then paused. Well, mostly. Miss Whitcomb waited. Silence had a way of encouraging honesty. It's that business with the Harrington house, he said finally. The clock, I mean. Ah, Miss Whitcomb said. The clock. It stopped at precisely 3:30, the Reverend continued, as if repeating the fact might help him understand it. And Mrs. Ephes Harrington insists it's meaningless. Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. People often insist on that, she said, particularly when things feel inconvenient. The Reverend frowned. You don't think it means something? I think, Miss Whitcomb replied calmly, that clocks rarely stop without a reason. Whether we understand that reason immediately is another matter entirely. She wished him a pleasant morning and continued on her way. At the post office, the usual quiet exchange of letters and parcels unfolded. Miss Whitcomb collected her mail and lingered longer than necessary. Eventually, Mrs. Poshu Finch leaned closer over the counter. Funny thing, she whispered. 3 clocks in the village needed fixing this week. Miss Whitcomb raised an eyebrow. Oh? One at the Harrington house, one at the old mill, and one at Mrs. Bellamy's. And do you recall, Miss Whitcomb asked gently, what time they stopped? Mrs. Finch thought for a moment. Well, now that you mention it, she hesitated, I believe all 3 were around 3:30. Miss Whitcomb nodded. I see. That afternoon, she walked toward the Harrington house. Not directly. She never went directly. She passed the green first, then the bakers, then the row of cottages that all looked faintly apologetic for existing. Finally, she arrived. Mrs. Broth Harrington greeted her with practiced politeness. Miss Whitcomb, she said, smiling a little too tightly. I was in the neighborhood, Miss Whitcomb replied, and thought I might stop by. The hallway clock stood proudly on the wall. Its hands were frozen. 3:30. Still not working? Miss Whitcomb asked lightly. Oh, it's just an old thing, Mrs. Harrington said quickly. Probably overdue for repairs. Of course, Miss Whitcomb agreed. Old things often carry stories with them. Mrs. Harrington shifted uncomfortably. I'm sure it's nothing. Miss Whitcomb said nothing in return. She simply looked at the clock, listened to the quiet, noticed what wasn't being said. That evening, back in her own cottage, Miss Whitcomb sat by the fire. The clock in her hallway still had not moved. She could have wound it. She chose not to. Some mysteries, she knew, revealed themselves not through action, but through patience. And time, even when it appeared to stop, had a way of moving forward all the same. Chapter 3. The Missing Clockmaker. The following morning arrived without ceremony. No bells rang. No doors slammed. The village woke as it always did, slowly, politely, pretending that nothing had changed. Miss Clara Whitcomb noticed immediately that something had. She felt it not in the air, but in the rhythm of things. People lingered longer at doorways. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Glances were exchanged that carried more meaning than words ever could. The clock in her hallway remained still. 3:30. She smiled faintly as she poured her tea. Still thinking, she murmured to it. Later that day, she took her usual walk, not because she needed fresh air, but because walking had a way of loosening truths that preferred to remain tightly wound. At the edge of the village green, she encountered Mrs. Bellamy. Mrs. Bellamy. Bellamy was the sort of woman who believed firmly in routine. Tea at 4, letters answered immediately, shoes polished every Sunday. Today, her routine had frayed. Good afternoon, Miss Whitcomb said gently. Oh, good afternoon, Mrs. Bellamy replied, then hesitated. You wouldn't happen to know a good clock repair man? Miss Whitcomb looked thoughtful. Is yours not working? Mrs. Bellamy sighed. It stopped last night. And the time? Miss Whitcomb asked. Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. 3:30. Miss Whitcomb nodded. Curious hour, she said quietly. Mrs. Bellamy leaned closer, lowering her voice. I woke suddenly, she confessed. Couldn't tell you why. Just awake. Miss Whitcomb listened carefully, and when you looked at the clock, it had stopped, Mrs. Bellamy said, as if it had frozen in shock. Miss Whitcomb thanked her and continued on. That afternoon, she paid a visit to the old mill. It had not been in use for years, but Mr. Harrington still insisted on maintaining it. She found him there, adjusting a set of tools with unnecessary force. "Good afternoon," she said. He startled. "Oh, Miss Whitcomb, I didn't hear you." "That happens," she replied calmly. "People often don't hear things they aren't expecting." He frowned slightly. "You come about the clock, haven't you?" "I've come about the time," Miss Whitcomb corrected gently. He laughed nervously. "It's a coincidence." "Of course," she said. "Coincidences are very useful things." He wiped his hands on a cloth. "People are talking." "Yes," Miss Whitcomb said. "They usually do when silence grows uncomfortable." He hesitated. "You don't believe there's something behind it, do you?" Miss Whitcomb met his eyes. "I believe," she said softly, "that moments leave impressions, sometimes even on objects." That evening, the village lights flickered on one by one. Miss Whitcomb sat by her fire once more. She took out a small notebook. Inside were dates, times, small observations that others had dismissed. 3:30 appeared again and again. She closed the notebook. At that exact moment, a knock came at the door. She rose calmly. On the threshold stood Reverend Miles, his face pale, his hat forgotten in his hands. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, "I believe you were right." She smiled gently. "About which thing, Reverend?" He swallowed. "The time," he said, "and what it might mean." Miss Whitcomb stepped aside. "Then please," she said, "come in. It seems the village is ready to remember something it tried very hard to forget." The clock in the hallway remained still. 3:30. Waiting. Chapter 4. Messages in Silence. The fire crackled softly as Reverend Miles settled into the armchair. Miss Whitcomb poured him tea, her movements unhurried, as though time itself had agreed to behave politely in her presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Silence, she knew, was not emptiness. It was an invitation. "It was years ago," the Reverend said finally. "The winter before Mrs. Harrington moved here." Miss Whitcomb nodded. "That was a difficult winter," she said. "People tend to remember winters like that. They also tend to forget what they'd rather not recall," he added quietly. She waited. "There was a man," he said. "Thomas Reed, a clockmaker." Miss Whitcomb's eyes softened. "Yes," she said, "I remember him. He lived near the mill," the Reverend continued. "Kept odd hours. Said clocks listen better at night." Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. The Reverend shifted uneasily. "One night he never came home." Miss Whitcomb lifted her teacup. "And what time was it when he was last seen?" Reverend Miles hesitated. 3:30. The words settled between them. "He had written a letter," the Reverend said, "to someone in the village." Miss Whitcomb's hand paused. "A letter often carries more weight than a spoken word," she said gently. "It was never delivered," he admitted. "Disappeared along with him." Miss Whitcomb rose slowly and crossed the room. She looked at the stopped clock. "Sometimes," she said softly, "letters arrive late, but not too late." The Reverend looked up sharply. "Do you think this has something to do with him?" "I think," Miss Whitcomb replied, "that time has been waiting for the right moment to speak again." That night she slept lightly, not because she was afraid, but because she was listening. At precisely 3:30 she woke. The house was silent, and yet something felt present. The clock in the hallway creaked. Just once, in the morning, Miss Whitcomb paid a visit to Mrs. Finch at the post office. "Do you keep old records?" she asked casually. Mrs. Finch hesitated. "Some." "Why?" "I was wondering," Miss Whitcomb said, "if you recall a letter that was never delivered." Mrs. Finch paled slightly. "Oh my, that is a yes," Miss Whitcomb observed kindly. "It was addressed to Mrs. Harrington," Mrs. Finch whispered. "Before she was Mrs. Harrington." Miss Whitcomb thanked her and stepped outside. The village bell tolled the hour. She checked her watch. 3:30. Time, it seemed, was no longer content with silence. Chapter 5. The postman's secret. Miss Whitcomb did not hurry home. Hurrying, she believed, often frightened the truth back into hiding. Instead, she walked the long way around the village, past hedges trimmed just a little too neatly, past windows that reflected the afternoon light without revealing much inside. At the edge of the lane she paused. The old cottage where Thomas Reed had lived still stood there, empty, waiting. The door yielded easily. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface, except for one small table near the window. Miss Whitcomb noticed that at once. Something had been moved there recently. She ran a finger along the edge. Clean. She opened a drawer. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed papers, tied with twine. Letters. She did not read them all. She did not need to. One envelope caught her attention, addressed in careful handwriting. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington, dated years ago. Miss Whitcomb replaced the letters exactly as she found them. Some discoveries, she knew, were meant to mature before being spoken aloud. That evening, the village gathered for supper at the hall. Miss Whitcomb took her seat quietly. Conversation flowed politely at first. Then someone mentioned the clocks. A hush followed. "It's just coincidence," Mr. Harrington said loudly. "Nothing more." Miss Whitcomb met his gaze calmly. "Coincidences," she said softly, "become patterns when ignored long enough." A few heads nodded. Mrs. Harrington's hands trembled slightly around her teacup. Later, as the hall emptied, she approached Miss Whitcomb. "You've been asking questions," she said sharply. "Only the sort that ask to be answered," Miss Whitcomb replied. Mrs. Whitcomb replied. Harrington's voice lowered. "That letter was never meant to arrive." Miss Whitcomb looked at her kindly. "Letters don't concern themselves with intentions," she said, "only with truth." The village clock struck. Miss Whitcomb checked her watch. 3:30. Mrs. Harrington closed her eyes, and for the first time, the silence spoke back. Chapter 6. Miss Whitcomb left the hall alone. The night had settled into the village like a heavy shawl, muffling footsteps and softening edges. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Somewhere, a door closed more carefully than necessary. She walked slowly, counting her steps without meaning to. At the Harrington gate, she stopped. The house was dark, save for one window on the upper floor. Someone was awake. Miss Whitcomb did not knock. Not yet. Instead, she turned back toward her own cottage, her mind arranging details the way other people arranged flowers deliberately and with great care. At home, the clock still waited. 3:30. She sat beside it, listening to the quiet tick that never came. Thomas Reed had been a clockmaker, a man who understood pauses. Men like that rarely disappeared by accident. She took out her notebook and added one more line. "Mrs. Harrington awake, light on. After meeting." She closed the book. Outside, the wind stirred. Branches brushed against glass, and for just a moment only, a moment, the clock's second hand trembled. Miss Whitcomb smiled. Chapter 7. The next morning brought a pale, misty light over Aldwick. Miss Whitcomb stepped out into the quiet streets, the cobblestones damp with overnight dew. She did not hurry. There was no need. Truth, she knew, moved at its own pace. At the edge of the village near the old oak that had witnessed decades of whispered secrets, she paused. Someone had left a note there, pinned lightly to the bark. No handwriting, she recognized. Only a brief message, 3:30. "Watch." She studied it calmly. The breeze shifted the edges, carrying with it a faint scent of the brook nearby. Damp earth and moss. Miss Whitcomb tucked the note into her coat pocket. Nothing hurried her. She continued her walk, observing windows, chimneys, and shutters, as though each might offer a clue. By mid-morning she reached the Harrington house once again. Mrs. Harrington was in the garden, tending to her roses with meticulous care. "Good morning," Miss Whitcomb said softly. Mrs. Harrington's hands paused. "Clara," she whispered, her voice tinged with unease. There's something not right. I can feel it. Miss Whitcomb nodded, understanding more than words could express. It is the clocks, she said quietly. They have been silent at the same time for a reason, and they are trying to tell us something. Mrs. Harrington shivered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. What do you mean? Time is rarely idle, Miss Whitcomb explained. It speaks to those who know how to listen. Together, they walked toward the hallway clock. 3:30, frozen, steadfast, waiting. Miss Whitcomb studied it carefully. She listened to the silence, as though it were a voice. The garden behind them swayed gently with the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a bell chimed softly. A letter slipped quietly from the pocket of her coat, the one Thomas Reed had written long ago. She held it delicately. "This," she said, "is part of what we've been missing." Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened, yet she said nothing. Time, for just a moment, seemed suspended. Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly, not a victory smile, not one of certainty, merely the satisfaction of observation, for she knew that answers were coming slowly, patiently, and 3:30, as always, was at the centre of it all. Chapter 8. The village of Aldwick had settled into its afternoon rhythm, but for Miss Whitcomb nothing was ordinary any more. She moved slowly along the lane, noting the soft flutter of curtains, the way a cat stretched lazily in a sunbeam, even the gentle creak of a gate swinging in the breeze. All of it mattered. Everything mattered. 3:30 had become more than a time. It was a signal, a rhythm she could feel beneath her feet, in the way the world shifted ever so slightly. At the Harrington house, Mrs. Harrington had begun to pace, each step measured, each breath deliberate. Miss Whitcomb entered quietly, her presence calm, grounding. "The letters, Mrs. Auld," Harrington whispered. "All these years I never knew." Miss Whitcomb nodded. "Sometimes messages wait for the right moment to be heard," she said softly, "and sometimes the moment arrives slowly, quietly, so that no one is startled." They approached the hallway clock together. 3:30. The hands did not move, but Miss Whitcomb could almost hear them speak. She set the letters gently on the table beside the clock. One by one they were arranged in order, a timeline unfolding in careful, deliberate strokes. "Do you remember Thomas Reed?" Miss Whitcomb asked. Mrs. Harrington's gaze softened. "I do. The clockmaker. He was always so particular about time." "Indeed," Miss Whitcomb said, "and he knew that certain moments required attention, not just any attention, but careful listening." The air in the room shifted. A soft warmth settled over them, as if the house itself had been waiting, holding its breath. Outside, the village continued its gentle routines, unaware of the silent drama unfolding within. Miss Whitcomb leaned closer to the letters, reading fragments aloud, names, dates, places, stories, half forgotten, now resurfacing. The clock remained still, but the sense of anticipation grew, like the hush before a soft rain begins. Somewhere, far off, a bell chimed, echoing faintly through the village streets, and for the first time in decades, the past and present felt perfectly aligned, woven together by something invisible, yet unmistakable. 3:30. Miss Whitcomb smiled, knowing that the answers were no longer distant. They were here, waiting. And so the mystery continued, gently, patiently, exactly as it should. Chapter 9. The evening settled over Alderwick like a soft, familiar blanket. Miss Whitcomb returned home slowly, the village quiet around her. The postman's footsteps had long since faded, and only the faint murmur of the brook reminded her that the world beyond her cottage still moved. Inside, the hallway clock remained frozen. 3:30. Steadfast, patient, almost expectant. She poured herself tea, letting the warmth fill her hands, letting the ritual anchor her mind. Then a soft knock at the door. She rose, careful not to startle. At the threshold stood a young man, hat in hand, eyes wide with curiosity and hesitation. "Miss Whitcomb," he said, I found something at the mill." She nodded quietly, inviting him inside. Together they walked to the table, where the letters lay carefully arranged beside the clock. He laid a small, worn notebook on top. Miss Whitcomb picked it up gently. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the words inside were unmistakable. Thomas Reed had written them, all of them. The notebook told a story of careful observation, of secrets kept and revealed in precise moments, of a man who understood that time could speak in subtle, powerful ways. 3:30, she realized, had been a marker, not an accident, not a coincidence, but a signal, a deliberate pause meant to draw attention, to align people with the rhythm of truth. The young man looked at her expectantly. "What should we do?" he asked. Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. "Observe first," she said, "then act if necessary. Patience often reveals more than haste ever could." They sat together by the fire, listening to the soft crackle and the distant sounds of the village. The letters and notebook lay between them like a bridge connecting past and present. Outside, lamps glowed warmly behind curtains, windows reflecting quiet streets and soft shadows. Miss Whitcomb thought of Thomas Reed and of the careful patterns he had left behind. Patterns only those who truly listened could discern. She sipped her tea, feeling the gentle rhythm of the day fade into evening. 3:30, she thought, was not just a time. It was a lesson, a whisper of patience, observation, and subtle understanding. And with that knowledge, the mystery of the clocks and the letters and the village itself began to reveal itself, ever so slowly, to those willing to notice. Chapter 10. The following morning, Aldwych stirred gently under a pale light. Miss Whitcomb rose from her chair, careful not to disturb the quiet that had settled over her cottage. She poured herself tea, letting the warmth seep slowly into her hands, and looked once more at the stopped clock. 3:30. A soft sigh escaped her lips, not of frustration, but of acknowledgment. Time had paused, and now it seemed, finally, ready to speak. She gathered the letters in the notebook, arranging them neatly in her bag, then set out for the mill. The streets were calm. Villagers went about their routines, unaware that something subtle, almost imperceptible, was unfolding beneath the ordinary rhythm of life. At the mill, she found the young man waiting, standing near the large wooden doors that had not been opened in decades. "Good morning," Miss Whitcomb said softly. "The mill seems unusually attentive today." He smiled nervously. "I think it's waiting for us," he replied. Inside, the air was cool, filled with the scent of dust and aged wood. Sunlight streamed through broken panes, illuminating motes that danced lazily in the quiet. Miss Whitcomb set the notebook on a workbench. She traced the words with her fingers, feeling the deliberate care of each line, each observation. "Thomas Reed wanted someone to notice," she murmured. "And now, after all these years, we are noticing." The young man nodded, understanding the weight of that simple truth. They moved carefully through the mill, examining clocks, gears, and old tools. Each object seemed to hum faintly, as if whispering fragments of a story only a patient listener could hear. Hours passed. Light shifted, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Miss Whitcomb made no move to correct the stopped clocks. She only observed. She only listened. 3:30 came and went. The clocks remained still, and yet the sense of anticipation grew stronger. It was not the stopping of time that mattered, she realized, but the attention it commanded, the pause, the quiet, the invitation to notice what had been forgotten. Outside, the village continued its slow, steady life, but inside the mill, the past and present were quietly aligning. Miss Whitcomb closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Time, she thought, is a patient teacher, and sometimes it waits decades to offer its lesson. The afternoon sunlight softened as Miss Whitcomb and the young man carefully sorted the letters and notes on the mill's workbench. Each document revealed small details, dates, times, names that had been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. Miss Whitcomb read slowly, savoring the deliberate phrasing of Thomas Reed's handwriting. Every word mattered. Every pause, every indentation was intentional. "Do you see this?" she asked, pointing to a note tucked inside the bundle. It mentions 3 clocks. All stopped at 3:30. The young man leaned closer. It's more than coincidence, isn't it? Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. Coincidence rarely repeats itself so precisely, she said. Patterns emerge when one pays attention, and this is a pattern. They moved on to examine the mill itself. Old gears, dusty shells, forgotten tools, they all seemed to hum with subtle significance. Miss Whitcomb's keen eyes noticed small scratches on the floor, faint marks that suggested someone had moved with care or secrecy. The young man asked, was Thomas Reed trying to tell someone something? Miss Whitcomb considered the question. Not just one person, she said. He trusted that those who listened carefully would understand. Patience and attention were his intended recipients. A sudden gust of wind rattled a window pane. Outside, the village continued its gentle rhythm. The postman passed slowly, a dog barked once, then was silent. Time moved everywhere else, but inside the mill it seemed to pause, suspended in anticipation. Miss Whitcomb closed the notebook for a moment and looked at the young man. Sometimes, she said, answers are not revealed by action alone. They are revealed by observation, by noticing the subtle things that others ignore. 3:30 approached again. The silence of the stopped clocks pressed softly against them, and then Miss Whitcomb realized something. The letter, the clocks, the subtle marks in the mill all pointed to a single truth. The past had been waiting patiently to speak, and now, with careful attention, it was finally beginning to do so. The young man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the discovery settle gently. For all its quietness, this moment was monumental. Miss Whitcomb smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Time, she said softly, is patient, but it never forgets. As the late afternoon light softened into gold, Miss Whitcomb and the young man continued their careful examination of the mill. Every clock, every tool, every letter seemed to whisper secrets of a past long buried, yet waiting patiently to be uncovered. She lifted a small, dust-covered wooden box from a shelf. Inside lay a collection of keys, old and tarnished, each labeled in faint, careful handwriting. Thomas Reed liked to be precise, she murmured. Every key had its place, just as every moment had its meaning. The young man leaned in, eyes wide with curiosity. Do you think one of these keys will open something important? Perhaps, Miss Whitcomb said, her voice soft but deliberate. Or perhaps the key itself is the message, teaching us to notice details we often overlook. She set the box down and ran her fingers along the workbench. A faint groove caught her attention. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it led toward a small panel in the wall. 3:30. The time came again, like a soft echo in the quiet mill. Miss Whitcomb approached the panel slowly, observing the wood grain, the faint scratches. She pressed gently, and the panel shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay another letter, yellowed with age. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas Reed. She unfolded it carefully. The words were deliberate, patient and precise. To those who notice, the letter began. Time speaks to those willing to listen. Do not fear the stillness. The moment of truth will reveal itself. Miss Whitcomb read the letter aloud to the young man. Its rhythm was calm, measured, almost hypnotic. They both paused, letting the words sink in. Outside, the village hummed with ordinary life, unaware that a secret long held was finally coming into focus. She folded the letter and tucked it gently into her coat. This, she said softly, is what has been waiting. Everything else is merely preparation. The young man nodded, understanding now the weight of what had been uncovered. The silence of the clocks, the letters, the hidden compartment. It was all deliberate, all waiting, all teaching the patient how to perceive what others missed. 3:30 had become more than a time. It was a signal, a guide, a gentle reminder that attention, care, and patience could illuminate truths hidden for decades. Miss Whitcomb stood quietly looking around the mill, absorbing the stillness. Yes, she murmured, time remembers, and those who notice are the ones who finally understand. The evening air had turned cool as Miss Whitcomb and the young man left the mill. The village streets were quiet, soft shadows stretching along the cobblestones, and the faint scent of wood smoke drifted from chimneys. Miss Whitcomb held the letter gently in her hand. She did not speak immediately. The silence itself carried weight. 3:30. The time seemed to hum softly in her mind, a constant, patient rhythm guiding her steps. As they reached the Harrington gate, Mrs. Harrington appeared, her face pale yet resolute. "You found it," she said softly, almost in a whisper. "Yes," Miss Whitcomb replied calmly. "And now it is time to understand." They entered the house together. The hallway clock remained still, frozen at 3:30, its hands like quiet sentinels guarding the past. Miss Whitcomb laid the letters and the notebook on the table. The young man placed the keys beside them. Mrs. Harrington leaned forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the old documents. "Thomas Reed, he wanted to tell me something," she asked, her voice barely audible. "He wanted someone to notice," Miss Whitcomb explained. "Someone patient, careful, willing to observe the smallest details. The clocks, the letters, even the mill, they were all part of the message." Mrs. Harrington's eyes widened with understanding. "I never knew. I thought it was just coincidence." Miss Whitcomb shook her head softly. "Nothing of this nature is ever coincidence. 3:30 has been more than a time. It has been a signal, a pause meant to guide, to reveal, to teach." The young man watched quietly, absorbing the weight of the revelation. It was as though the village itself had held its breath, waiting for them to comprehend what had been quietly unfolding for decades. Miss Whitcomb took a deep breath, feeling the soft rhythm of time around them. "The past is patient," she said, "and it speaks in ways that cannot be ignored. All we need to do is listen." Outside, a gentle wind rustled the leaves, and a faint bell chimed in the distance. 3:30 had come again, but this time it no longer felt like a pause. It felt like an awakening. Mrs. Harrington exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and wonder on her face. "Yes," she whispered, "I understand now." Miss Whitcomb smiled gently. "Then the lesson is complete. For those who pay attention, time has been patient, and so have we." And as the village settled into the quiet of the night, the clocks, the letters, and the hidden secrets all seemed to hum softly with approval. 3:30, at last, had been acknowledged. Night had fully fallen over Alderwick. The streets were empty, the lamps casting warm pools of light along the cobblestones. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the breeze disturbed the stillness. Miss Whitcomb returned to her cottage, the letters and notebook safely tucked into her bag. The young man followed, his steps quiet, reflective. Inside, the fire crackled softly. The clock in the hallway remained frozen at 3:30, its hands unmoving, yet somehow still alive with meaning. She placed the letters carefully on the table, lining them up with meticulous precision. The young man watched, fascinated by her calm attention to detail. "Everything tells a story," she said softly, "if you are willing to notice. The letters, the clocks, even the pauses in our own conversations, they all matter." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand now," he said. "It's not just about time. It's about paying attention, isn't it?" Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. "Yes, and about understanding that sometimes the answers we seek are not revealed immediately. They require patience, observation, quiet reflection." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The village was asleep, unaware that secrets long hidden were finally coming to light. Miss Whitcomb picked up the notebook once more, reading the final lines written by Thomas Reed decades ago. "Those who listen will understand. Those who hurry will miss. Time has its own rhythm, and it speaks only to those who notice." She set the notebook down. The young man looked at her. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Miss Whitcomb considered the question. "Now," she said softly, "we continue to watch. We continue to listen. The past has spoken, and the present is ready to respond." She rose and crossed the room slowly. The clock's hands remained at 3:30, but it no longer seemed to matter. The lesson had been learned, the message received. Outside, a lone bell tolled in the distance, its sound echoing gently across the village. Time, Miss Whitcomb knew, was never truly still. It merely waits for those who are patient enough to notice, and Alderwick, under the quiet night sky, had finally been noticed. The next morning dawned pale and quiet, a mist lingering over the village rooftops, softening edges and muting the usual sounds of life. Miss Whitcomb stepped outside, feeling the cool air on her cheeks, letting it clear her mind and sharpen her attention. The village seemed ordinary, but she knew better. 3:30 had left its mark. The hidden messages, the subtle signals, they lingered in every corner, waiting for those patient enough to notice. She walked slowly toward the Harrington house. Mrs. Harrington was already in the garden, moving among the roses with careful hands, her expression more relaxed now than it had been the night before. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," Miss Whitcomb said gently. "Have you slept well?" "Yes," came the quiet reply, "though I feel different, lighter, somehow." Miss Whitcomb nodded. "That is the effect of understanding. Time speaks in ways we often miss. 3:30 has always been more than a time." Mrs. Harrington looked at her, eyes wide. "I think I finally realize it's not just the clocks, it's everything. The letters, the message, the waiting." Miss Whitcomb smiled faintly. "Exactly. Patience allows us to hear what the world is trying to tell us, and sometimes even decades of silence cannot prevent the truth from reaching the right ears." The young man appeared from the porch, holding the notebook. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted. "The way all the pieces fit together." Miss Whitcomb gestured toward the clocks in the hall. "Observe carefully. Notice the patterns. Time teaches, but it does not hurry. Those who understand its lessons are rewarded with clarity, patience, and insight." The sun broke through the mist, casting gentle light across the garden. The village, for all its ordinary appearances, seemed brighter somehow, as if the very streets had been holding their breath for decades and were now exhaling in quiet relief. 3:30 approached once more. The clocks remained still, but the moment no longer carried tension. It carried understanding, acknowledgement, completion. Miss Whitcomb looked at Mrs. Harrington and the young man, her eyes soft but certain. "The past has spoken, and now we may continue." Outside, the birds began their morning songs, each note carrying lightly through the village, a gentle reminder that time moves forward, even when it pauses to teach its lessons. 3:30, she thought quietly, is not just a moment. It is a memory, a signal, a guide, and those who listen carefully will always find what they seek. Evening settled gently over Alderwick, casting long, soft shadows across the village streets. Miss Whitcomb sat in her chair by the fire, the letters and notebook carefully arranged on the table before her. The soft crackle of flames filled the quiet room. 3:30. The clock remained frozen, yet its presence felt alive, as if it had been waiting for this very moment to release its subtle lesson. She traced her fingers along the edges of the letters, feeling the careful penmanship, the delicate folds, the decades of patience pressed into the paper. The young man entered quietly, carrying a small bundle of old papers he had found tucked away in the mill. "Look at this," he said softly. "More observations, more notes." He wanted everything noticed. Miss Whitcomb nodded slowly. Yes, every detail was deliberate. Each pause, each mark, each measured action, Thomas Reed designed them to be discovered by someone patient enough to observe. They laid the papers beside the letters, creating a mosaic of time, attention, and careful observation. Mrs. Harrington joined them, her hands resting lightly on the table. "I see it now," she whispered. "Every pause, every silence. It was meant to teach me how to listen." Miss Whitcomb's gaze softened. "Precisely. The clocks stopping at 3:30 were not mere accidents. They were signals, markers of patience waiting for recognition." Outside, the village continued its quiet evening routines. A dog barked once in the distance. A soft wind rustled the leaves. Time moved forward elsewhere, but here within this room it had paused, offering understanding to those willing to receive it. Miss Whitcomb picked up the notebook again, reading the final lines slowly, deliberately. Attention is the truest gift one can give. Observe carefully. Patience reveals what haste obscures. Time waits for those who notice. She set the notebook down. The fire flickered, casting gentle shadows that danced across the walls. 3:30 had come and gone countless times, but tonight it felt different. Completed, a lesson absorbed, a message delivered. The young man exhaled softly, finally grasping the weight of the mystery they had unraveled together. Miss Whitcomb leaned back in her chair. Time had been patient, and those who listened had finally understood. Outside, Aldwych slept peacefully, the secrets it had held for decades quietly acknowledged, and the rhythm of 3:30 now a soft, enduring memory. The night had deepened over Aldwych, and the village lay in a gentle, almost reverent quiet. Miss Whitcomb sat by the fire, the letters, keys, and notebook spread carefully before her. The young man and Mrs. Harrington were close by, each absorbed in the quiet gravity of what they had discovered. 3:30 had passed once again, yet its significance lingered, like the soft echo of a bell fading into stillness. Miss Whitcomb took a deep breath. "The past," she said softly, "is patient. It watches. It waits for those who are willing to notice. And when the moment is right, it speaks." Mrs. Harrington's eyes glistened with understanding. "I never realized," she whispered, "time and patience could be a teacher." The young man nodded, and Thomas Reed, he wanted us to see it all, to notice, to understand. "Yes," Miss Whitcomb said, "and now we've listened, we've observed. And the lesson has arrived exactly as it was intended." The fire crackled softly, casting gentle shadows that flickered across the room. Miss Whitcomb stood slowly, walking to the hallway clock. She touched it lightly. 3:30, still unmoving, yet somehow complete. "Time is not cruel," she said softly, "nor is it hurried. It is patient, deliberate, and precise, and when it chooses, it delivers truth to those ready to perceive it." Outside, a soft wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the quiet murmur of the village night. Even the stars seemed to lean closer, as if observing the peaceful resolution of a story decades in the making. Miss Whitcomb returned to the fire. She poured tea for Mrs. Harrington and the young man, and they sat together, quietly sharing the moment. 3:30 had been more than a time. It had been a guide, a signal, a gentle reminder that patience and careful attention revealed truths often hidden from hasty eyes. And as the village of Aldwych slept peacefully, Miss Whitcomb closed her eyes briefly, listening to the rhythm of the night. Time had spoken, and those who noticed had finally understood. The fire's warmth filled the room, the letters lay in careful order, and for the first time in decades, the clocks, the past and the present, were quietly in harmony. 3:30 was no longer a pause. It was a story completed, a lesson learned, and a gentle promise that time, ever patient, always remembers.